Here's the thing. We have different ideas about what it means to be a hero. He sees the good in everyone.
Brought destruction. Defended.
Welcome to Z Cineplex, say your ultimate destination for the most in-depth, detail-packed movie breakdowns on all of YouTube. Today, we're soaring into the skies with one of DC's most iconic and beloved heroes, a Supergirl. Whether you're a die-hard comic book fan who's followed Kara Zor-El since her very first appearance on the printed page, or you're someone who just discovered the Girl of Steel and can't get enough of her incredible story, you have landed in exactly the right place. On this channel, we don't just scratch the surface, we dive deep into every frame, every scene, every hidden detail, every Easter egg, and every jaw-dropping moment that makes this film an unforgettable experience. From the breathtaking visual effects that bring Argo City to life, to the powerful performances that give Supergirl her heart and soul, we're going to break it all down for you like no one else can. So buckle up, because this is going to be one epic ride, and trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to see Supergirl in a whole new light. If you're new here, make sure you smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single upload from Z Cineplex, the most detailed movie channel on YouTube. Now without further ado, let's fly. At Y Broken Bar Sedilla at my diaresis Sedilla eth negation. Supergirl is a 2026 American superhero film rooted in the rich and legendary mythology of DC Comics, bringing to life one of the publisher's most iconic and enduring characters, Kara Zor-El, the cousin of Superman and a hero known to the world as Supergirl. The film is helmed by director Craig Gillespie, a filmmaker celebrated for his ability to blend intense human emotion with bold, genre-defining storytelling, most famously known for his acclaimed work on Tonya, bringing that same raw, character-driven energy to the superhero genre in a way that feels completely fresh and unlike anything DC fans have seen before. The screenplay was crafted by writer Renan O'Gara, who was entrusted with the monumental task of translating one of DC's most emotionally complex and critically beloved modern comic book runs into a full-length cinematic experience, ensuring that the heart, darkness, and moral depth of the source material were preserved and brought powerfully to the big screen. At the center of the film is the extraordinarily talented Alcock, who steps into the iconic red and blue cape to portray Kara Zor-El. Supergirl, a role she first introduced to DCU audiences in the 2025 film Superman, where she made her debut and immediately captivated viewers with her fierce, compelling screen presence. In this standalone adventure, Kara's story takes a much darker and more personal turn, as she embarks on an intense, galaxy-spanning quest for revenge, a murderous and emotionally charged journey that pushes her to the very limits of her powers, her morality, and her identity as a hero. This is not your traditional feel-good superhero story. This is a gritty, raw, and deeply human tale about loss, rage, justice, and what it truly means to be super when the world has taken everything from you. Surrounding Alcock is a remarkable and diverse ensemble cast that elevates the film at every turn. Matthias Schoenaerts, the acclaimed Belgian actor known for his brooding intensity, joins the film in a key role, bringing his trademark gravitas to the DCU. Ridley also appears in a significant part, marking an exciting introduction to a fresh new face within this expanding universe. David Krumholtz, a versatile and deeply experienced actor, adds further depth to the supporting cast, while the talented Emily Beecham brings her own magnetic screen presence to the story. Perhaps most excitingly for DC fans, David Schoenaerts, who leads the DCU as Superman, appears in the film, further cementing the connected nature of this new universe and relationships between Kal-El and his cousin Kara. And in what is sure to be one of the film's most talked about elements, Jason Momoa also features in the cast, continuing his presence within the DC universe in what promises to be a fascinating and unexpected role. The entire film is produced by Peter Safran and James Gunn under the banner of DC Studios, the newly restructured powerhouse that is building this ambitious and interconnected new DC universe from the ground up with meticulous care and long-term vision. The road to bringing this version of Supergirl to the screen was a long and fascinating one. Development on a Supergirl-centered film originally began as far back as August 2018, when the project was being developed under the umbrella of the then-ongoing DC Extended Universe, Z. During that era, the character of Supergirl was eventually introduced to audiences in the 2023 blockbuster The Flash, where she was portrayed by Sasha Calle in a bold, action-packed performance that generated significant excitement and speculation about her future in the franchise. However, the trajectory of the project changed dramatically and permanently in October 2022. When visionary filmmaker James Gunn and veteran producer Peter Safran were appointed as the co-CEOs of DC Studios, signaling a complete creative overhaul and the beginning of an entirely new era for DC on screen. Under their bold new leadership, the previous plans for a Supergirl standalone film were set aside, and in January 2023, an exciting new announcement was made that this new Supergirl film would be a direct adaptation of the 2021 A22 comic book miniseries Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, written by the legendary Tom King and illustrated by the breathtakingly talented Bill Ridley. The miniseries had been universally praised by critics and fans alike as one of the finest DC comics in years. A beautifully written, visually stunning, and emotionally devastating story that reimagined Kara Zor-El as a complex, morally tested, and profoundly compelling hero navigating a universe far more dangerous and morally ambiguous than Earth. Adapting this beloved story for the screen was a statement of intent by Gunn and Safran, a declaration that this new DCU would be built on quality, depth, and genuine respect for the source material. By November 2023, Anna Nogueira had been officially hired to write the screenplay, beginning the detailed process of shaping the comic's sprawling, interstellar narrative into a cohesive and powerful film. Then, in January 2024, the hugely exciting casting announcement came. Alcock was confirmed in the role of Kara Zor-El, Supergirl, with the plan that she would first appear in Superman 2025, before leading her own film. Director Craig Gillespie officially came aboard the project in May 2024, completing the core creative team and setting the stage for production to begin. Principal photography on Supergirl commenced in January 2025 and wrapped in May 2025, spanning an impressive and varied range of locations that gave the film its distinctive visual identity. The bulk of the production was based at the legendary Warner Bros. Studios Leavesden in England, one of the most iconic and well-equipped film production facilities in the world, famously home to the Harry Potter franchise and numerous other blockbusters. Additional filming also took place across locations in London, utilizing the city's extraordinary architectural diversity to bring the film's world to life, as well as in the dramatic and breathtaking landscapes of Scotland, whose rugged, ancient, and overworldly terrain provided the perfect visual backdrop for the film's more cosmic and emotionally intense sequences. Supergirl made its grand world premiere on June 22, 2026, in the vibrant and culturally rich borough of Brooklyn, New York, a fitting and exciting location for a superhero premiere that immediately generated enormous buzz and conversation online. Just 4 days later, on June 26, 2026, The film received its wide theatrical release across the United States through Warner Bros. Pictures, putting it in front of audiences nationwide and kicking off what is sure to be a global conversation about DC's newest cinematic chapter. The film is an integral part of the DCU's overarching narrative framework known as Chapter 1, Gods and Monsters, the first major storytelling chapter of Gunn and Safran's long-term DCU plan, which is gradually assembling a rich and interconnected universe of heroes, villains, and mythology unlike anything DC has attempted before. Upon its release, Supergirl received mixed reviews from critics, with many praising Alcock's fierce and emotionally layered central performance, the film's darker and more mature tone, and its bold willingness to take the superhero genre in a less conventional direction, while others raised questions about pacing, narrative structure, and tonal balance. At the box office, the film has so far grossed $29 million, with its long-term commercial trajectory still unfolding as it continues its theatrical run around the world. Regardless of where the numbers ultimately land, Supergirl represents a genuinely significant and bold new statement for the DC Universe, a film that dares to tell a different kind of superhero story, anchored by an extraordinary lead performance and driven by a creative team with a clear and passionate vision for what DC cinema can and should be. Leading the film with what is already being regarded as one of the most exciting and fearless superhero performances in recent DC history is Alcock, who takes on the iconic role of Kara Zor-El, Supergirl, a character whose complexity, emotional depth, and moral ambiguity set her apart from virtually every other hero in the DC universe. Alcock's Supergirl is not the bright, optimistic, and warmly heroic figure that casual audiences might expect when they hear the name. She is something far more raw, far more complicated, and far more fascinating than that. To understand who Kara is and why she is the way she is, one has to understand the profoundly different path her life took compared to that of her famous cousin. While Kal-El Superman was sent to Earth as an infant and grew up surrounded by the love, warmth, and grounded humanity of his adoptive parents on a Kansas farm, absorbing Earth's values and its people's capacity for help and kindness from his very earliest memories, Kara's experience could not have been more different. She grew up not on Earth, but on the drifting, dying remnant of Krypton, on Argo City, a civilization suspended in the void of space, slowly being poisoned by kryptonite radiation, where she watched the world around her deteriorate and the people she loved disappear one by one. She did not grow up sheltered by human warmth. She grew up surrounded by loss, by slow death, by the quiet and relentless grief of her people who survived the end of their world only to face a different, slower kind of ending. That experience has left deep and permanent marks on Kara's soul, making her harder, more jaded, more guarded, and more morally complex than her cousin, a person who has seen too much suffering to maintain the kind of pure, uncomplicated optimism that defines Superman's worldview. This psychological complexity expresses itself in fascinating and very human ways. One of the most revealing details about Kara's character is the way she chooses to spend her free time, because Kryptonians derive their superhuman powers and their remarkable healing abilities directly from the radiation of yellow suns like Earth's own. Exposure to a red sun has the opposite effect, stripping them of their powers and making them essentially mortal. And Kara, who clearly finds something deeply liberating about occasionally being free of the burden of invincibility, deliberately seeks out planets with red suns specifically so that she can get drunk, something that is physically impossible for her under a yellow sun. It is a wonderfully telling character detail, speaking volumes about a young woman who craves normalcy, who wants to feel human, who needs an escape from the weight of being extraordinary, and who is, at her core, still figuring out who she is and how she wants to live. Producer James Gunn, who has shaped the vision for this entire new DC universe, described the character he envisioned Alcock bringing to life as a pixie-ish, but very attitudinal character, someone with a certain lightness and unconventional energy on the surface, but with a fierce, bristling inner fire that can flash into sharp and dangerous territory at any moment. Both Gunn and director Craig Gillespie were emphatic and consistent in describing Kara not as a traditional hero but as something altogether more interesting, an anti-hero, a person who does heroic things, but not always for clean or selfless reasons. and not always through means that a more conventional hero would sanction. Millie Alcock, with her extraordinary range and her ability to project both vulnerability and ferocity with equal conviction, was clearly the perfect choice to embody all of these contradictions in a single, unforgettable performance. The film's primary antagonist is Crumb of the Yellow Hills, portrayed with menacing and deeply unsettling intensity by the acclaimed Belgian actor Matthias Schoenaerts. Crumb is the ruthless and calculating leader of the Brigands, a sprawling, violent criminal organization that operates across multiple planets and star systems, functioning simultaneously as space pirates and horrifyingly as human traffickers, preying on the vulnerable and the powerless across the galaxy with complete and chilling impunity. Schoenaerts, who has built a career on portraying characters of tremendous physical and psychological menace, brings all of that considerable talent to bear on Crumb, creating a villain who feels genuinely dangerous and genuinely evil, not in a cartoonish or theatrical way, but in the quiet, cold, matter-of-fact way that makes real monsters so terrifying. Crumb is not a man who rages or monologues, he is a man who simply does terrible things without remorse, and that calm, almost businesslike approach to cruelty makes him one of the most effective villains the DCU has yet produced. Playing the role of Ruth Marino, one of the film's most important and emotionally resonant characters, is the talented young actress Ridley. In what is sure to be a star-making performance, Ruth is a young girl carrying an almost unbearable weight. She is the last surviving member of her family, every one of whom was murdered at the hands of Crumb, and she has dedicated herself entirely and ferociously to a single purpose: vengeance. She is not a superhero, she does not have powers, she does not have resources or allies or any particular advantage in the vast and dangerous galaxy she is navigating. What she has is grief, rage, determination, and a refusal to accept that the man who destroyed her family will simply go unpunished. Her recruitment of Supergirl as her partner in this quest sets the entire central narrative of the film in motion, and the relationship that develops between Ruth and Kara, two very different people, one mortal and one superhuman, one burning with focused purpose and one adrift on existential uncertainty, becomes the emotional spine of the entire story. Ridley brings a remarkable maturity and emotional intelligence to the role, ensuring that Ruth never feels like a plot device but always like a fully realized, deeply human young woman whose journey is every bit as compelling as Supergirl's own. The role of Zor-El, Kara's father and one of the most important figures in her history and emotional life, is played by the wonderfully versatile David Krumholtz, an actor whose ability to balance warmth, intelligence, and quiet tragedy makes him ideally suited to portray this brilliant and heartbroken man. Zor-El is a scientist of the highest order, the man whose extraordinary genius and split-second decision-making saved as many Kryptonians as could be saved from the destruction of their planet, using his force field technology to separate Argo City from the doomed world beneath it and give his people a chance at survival. But he is also a father, a deeply loving, fiercely protective father who ultimately faces the most terrible choice any parent could imagine, forced to send his daughter away into the unknown rather than watch her die alongside everyone else. Krumholtz brings enormous humanity and quiet sorrow to this role, ensuring that Zor-El feels not like a mythological figure but like a real man crushed by impossible circumstances, doing the best he can with the time and the tools he has. As Allura and Kara's mother and Zor-El's devoted wife, the exceptionally talented Emily Beecham delivers what is, by necessity, a performance built on emotional impact and limited screen time. Allura is a woman defined by love, by strength, and ultimately by tragedy. She is one of the casualties of the kryptonite radiation that slowly kills the citizens of Argo City, and her death is one of the foundational wounds of Kara's life, a loss that shapes who Kara becomes and colors every aspect of her relationship with grief, with home, and with the idea of belonging. Beecham, an actress of considerable subtlety and depth, brings a warmth and a quiet dignity to Allura that makes her presence felt throughout the film long after the character is gone, a ghostly but loving influence that haunts Kara's journey in the most poignant possible way. Appearing in a significant supporting role and carrying with him the full weight and presence of the DCU's central hero is David Corenswet, who reprises his role as Kal-El, Clark Kent, Superman following his starring turn in the 2025 Superman film. Schoenaerts with Superman is, in many ways, the mirror image of Alcock's Supergirl, where she is uncertain, jagged, and adrift. He is patient, grounded, and steady, where she pushes against the idea of putting down roots. He has embraced Earth completely and found in it everything he needs. Director Craig Gillespie spoke thoughtfully and insightfully about the dynamic between these two cousins, describing it as sometimes taking on the quality of an older sibling dynamic, a relationship that carries with it all the complicated, sometimes adversarial energy of that particular bond, with its mixture of genuine care and protective instinct on one side and fierce independence and occasional resentment on the other. Gillespie noted that while Superman embodies a kind of gentleness and patience that comes from a lifetime of stability and love, Kara is still in the grip of uncertainty, still working out who she is, where she belongs, and what kind of hero she wants to be. Their scenes together crackle with that tension and that love in equal measure, making their eventual reunion at the film's end all the more emotionally satisfying. One of the film's most eagerly anticipated and creatively exciting casting choices is Jason Momoa as Lobo, a role that marks a remarkable and fascinating new chapter for Momoa within the DC universe. Lobo is, in the grand tradition of great comic book characters, gloriously and maximally himself an enormous, foul-mouthed, virtually indestructible alien mercenary and bounty hunter who hails originally from the planet Zarnia, a world described in the comics as having once been a peaceful utopia before Lobo himself, as a young man, engineered the extinction of his own species for a school project and received top marks. He is chaos incarnate, a force of nature wearing the skin of a person, and he operates entirely outside the boundaries of conventional morality, motivated by money, by the thrill of the hunt, and by a personal code that is entirely his own and bears almost no resemblance to anyone else's. Momoa, who previously spent 7 years in the DC Extended Universe portraying Arthur Curry, Aquaman from 2016 through 2023, makes a complete and utterly committed transformation into this legendary character, bringing his own natural ferocity, physicality, and mild charisma to a role that feels tailor-made for exactly this kind of performer. Lobo's entry into the DCU is one of the most exciting developments in Gunn and Safran's new universe, and Momoa's portrayal promises to make the character a fan favorite for years to come. Beyond the principal cast, the film features a rich and carefully chosen array of supporting performers who bring additional texture, depth, and humanity to the story. Ferdinand Kingsley appears as Elias Nole Ruthai's father, a man whose murder at the hands of Cream sets the entire chain of events in motion and whose presence, though brief, carries enormous emotional weight as the human cost that gives Ruthai's quest its moral foundation and its heartbreaking urgency. Diarmaid Murdoch portrays John Boxton, the brigand's ruthless and capable second-in-command Crum's lieutenant and the organizational backbone of the criminal outfit, serving as both an immediate physical threat and a key target for the bounty hunter Lobo. And returning from the DCU's flagship film Superman, 2025, is the universally beloved Krypto, a Supergirl's superpowered dog and her most faithful and unconditional companion, whose poisoning at Crump's hands provides the ticking clock that drives the film's central action and whose survival becomes the most emotionally immediate stake in the entire story. Finally, in a delightful and surprising cameo that is sure to generate enormous conversation and laughter, Seth Rogen lends his unmistakable voice to a small alien that Kara encounters on a space bus, a brief, comedic, and thoroughly charming moment that perfectly captures the tonal balance of humor and heart that the best DCU films aspire to achieve. The background story of how Supergirl, 2026, ultimately came to exist is, in many ways, inseparable from the broader and deeply complicated history of DC's cinematic ambitions over the past decade, a history defined by extraordinary creative potential repeatedly undermined by corporate instability, strategic miscalculation, and an inability to establish the kind of unified, long-term creative vision that had made their primary competitor so dominant. To fully appreciate the journey that led to this film, one must understand not just the specific decisions made about Supergirl as a character and a property, but the entire turbulent institutional landscape within which those decisions were being made, unmade, and remade across nearly a decade of dramatic and often painful transformation. The story begins in August 2018, when Warner Bros. Pictures made what appeared at the time to be a meaningful and strategically sound creative commitment, bringing on accomplished screenwriter Oren Uziel to develop a feature film centered on the DC Comics character Supergirl. Uziel was a writer with genuine genre credentials and a demonstrated capacity for working within the specific demands and pressures of large-scale studio franchise filmmaking, and his hiring represented a real and concrete investment of institutional resources in a character who had long deserved her own cinematic spotlight. The decision to pursue a Supergirl film at this particular moment in time was not an arbitrary one. It emerged directly and urgently from the deeply uncomfortable creative and commercial position in which Warner Bros. And its DC Film division, DC Films, found themselves in the latter half of the 2010s. The DC Extended Universe, which the studio had been painstakingly and expensively constructing since the release of Zack Snyder's Man of Steel in 2013, had delivered a succession of films that had disappointed in varying but consistent degrees. A Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, 2016, had polarized audiences and critics with its stark, operatic tone and controversial creative choices. Suicide Squad, 2016, had underperformed critically despite strong initial box office, and Justice League, 2017, had been a widely reported production disaster, emerging from a troubled and famously chaotic production process involving the departure of original director Snyder and the extensive reshoots overseen by replacement director Joss Whedon. As a film that satisfied almost nobody and grossed considerably less than a team-up of DC's greatest heroes had any right to. Against this backdrop of critical disappointment and strategic uncertainty, Warner Bros. Was actively and urgently searching for new creative approaches that might help revitalize the franchise, reconnect with audiences, and establish a more consistent and sustainable foundation for DC on screen. A Supergirl-centered film, drawing on one of DC's most beloved and enduring characters who had never received a proper modern cinematic treatment, seemed like exactly the kind of fresh creative direction the franchise needed, even at this embryonic stage of development, with the project existing more as a creative intention and a writer's assignment than as any kind of fully formed plan. Warner Bros. Was already establishing at least one clear and publicly stated priority. The studio was described by those familiar with the internal conversations as being remarkably and unusually very vocal about its strong desire to hire a female director for the Supergirl project. This commitment was not accidental or incidental. It reflected both the broader cultural conversation sweeping through Hollywood at the time about the persistent underrepresentation of women behind the camera on major studio productions, and a very specific and recent object lesson in the commercial and critical power of female-directed superhero cinema. Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman, 2017, had been not only a massive global box office success but a genuinely acclaimed piece of filmmaking that had demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that female directors could helm major superhero blockbusters with extraordinary skill and impact. Warner Bros., having experienced that success firsthand, was clearly eager to replicate the formula with Supergirl, and their vocal commitment to hiring a female director signaled a genuine institutional belief that the character's story would be best served by a female creative perspective in the director's chair. The announcement of the Supergirl project also arrived accompanied by a significant and somewhat painful piece of collateral news that spoke to the broader restructuring of creative priorities taking place within the DCU at this time. The studio's strategic decision to pivot towards Supergirl as a major new centerpiece of the franchise was cited publicly as one of the key factors contributing to the confirmation that Henry Cavill, who had embodied Clark Kent, Superman in the DCU since the franchise's very first film and who had become, for better or worse and amid enormous controversy about the specific creative choices made with the character, one of the defining faces of DC's cinematic universe, was no longer anticipated to return to the role in future DCU productions. The logic, as much as any clear logic could be extracted from what was fundamentally a messy and publicly managed situation, appeared to be that a creative universe increasingly built around Supergirl and other new characters would not necessarily have the same need for or interest in the specific version of Superman that Cavill had been portraying. It was a significant and genuinely surprising development that generated enormous discussion and debate among the DC fanbase, many of whom had strong feelings about Cavill's portrayal and his future in the role. Cavill himself was not content to simply accept this outcome in silence. In the period following the reports about his uncertain future, he publicly and repeatedly indicated that he remained deeply committed to the role and very much wanted to return to playing Superman, expressing with evident sincerity his personal investment in the character and his hope that circumstances might change and a path back to the Cape might present itself. The situation was, by any measure, an awkward and uncomfortable public unraveling of what should have been a private creative discussion, and it became emblematic of the broader organizational dysfunction that was making it so difficult for DC to project the kind of confident, coherent creative vision that audiences and the industry expected from a major franchise operation. Despite all of the surrounding noise, uncertainty, and institutional turbulence, the Supergirl project appeared to be maintaining at least a degree of genuine forward momentum as 2018 gave way to 2019. Production on the film was tentatively penciled in to begin in early 2020, a timeline that, while clearly ambitious given the early state of development at the time of Oziel's hiring, nonetheless indicated that the studio had real intentions of moving the project from development into active production within a reasonably near-term time frame. The tentative 2020 production start suggested that at some level, Warner Brothers was treating this as a genuine priority rather than merely a development holding pattern. However, any and all such plans were rendered completely and instantly irrelevant by an event that neither the studio nor anyone else on Earth could have anticipated, planned for, or in any meaningful way prepared against: the global COVID-19 pandemic, which began its devastating spread across the world in the early months of 2020 and escalated with terrifying speed into one of the most disruptive and deadly global health crises in a century. Forced the complete and immediate shutdown of virtually the entire global entertainment industry. Film productions of every scale, at every stage of development or active shooting, were halted, studio lots were emptied, development processes were suspended, the elaborate machinery of Hollywood ground to a near complete stop almost overnight, and the human and economic cost was staggering. The Supergirl project was placed on indefinite hold as part of this industry-wide suspension, its tentative 2020 production schedule becoming not merely delayed but entirely moot, and its future rendered genuinely and deeply uncertain in ways that went far beyond the typical challenges and setbacks of developing a major studio film. As the world slowly, painfully, and unevenly began to emerge from the most acute phase of the pandemic's disruptions across 2020 and into 2021, and as the entertainment industry cautiously resumed something approaching normal operations, DC's cinematic universe began generating new developments that would prove enormously consequential for the Supergirl character and her cinematic future. In February 2021, a casting announcement arrived that brought fresh energy and genuine excitement to the question of who would bring Kara Zor-El to life on screen. Sasha Cale, a young Colombian-American actress who had built her reputation through her work on the long-running daytime drama The Young and the Restless, was officially confirmed in the role of Supergirl for the upcoming DC film The Flash, 2023. The Flash was positioned as a pivotal and ambitious entry in the DC, a multiversal adventure drawing on the concept of parallel timelines and alternate realities to bring together characters from across DC's cinematic history in ways that would both entertain existing fans and potentially reshape the direction of the franchise going forward. Cale's casting was met with considerable enthusiasm and genuine curiosity, and the reported details of her deal added further substance to the sense that this was a meaningful and long-term commitment. She had reportedly signed a multi-film contract with the DC, a standard industry mechanism for anchoring a new character to a franchise across multiple future productions, strongly suggesting that this Supergirl was intended to be a recurring and significant presence in the evolving DC cinematic world rather than merely a one-off guest appearance. This sense of institutional commitment to the character was further reinforced when DC's officially announced upcoming film slate was revealed to include a standalone Supergirl film with a projected release window of 2022 or 2023, an ambitious timeline that, while perhaps more optimistic than the actual state of development could realistically support, nonetheless represented a public commitment to the project's eventual realization. But just as the Supergirl project appeared to be finding new momentum and direction, the ground beneath the entire Warner Bros. Entertainment enterprise began to shift in profound and far-reaching ways, driven by forces operating at a level of corporate scale far beyond the concerns of any individual film or franchise. In April 2022, the media industry was fundamentally restructured when Discovery, Incorporated, a major media company with significant cable television assets, and Warner Media, the entertainment division of AT&T and the corporate parent of Warner Bros. Pictures, HBO, CNN, and numerous other major media brands, completed a landmark and long-anticipated merger to form the newly combined entity Warner Bros. Discovery, WBD. The merged company instantly became one of the largest and most powerful media conglomerates in the world, and it was placed under the leadership of David Zaslav, who assumed the role of president and chief executive officer with a clear and publicly stated mandate to rationalize the combined company's vast portfolio of assets, reduce its substantial debt burden, and establish a more efficient and commercially sustainable operational model across its many divisions and subsidiaries. For DC Entertainment and the DCO specifically, the arrival of Zaslav's leadership immediately and unmistakably signaled the beginning of a period of intense scrutiny and significant change. Zaslav made clear early and often that he viewed the state of DC's cinematic output as one of the new company's most pressing creative and commercial challenges, and that he intended to address it with the same decisive and sometimes brutal efficiency that characterized his broader approach to running the merged company. One of his most publicly stated priorities was finding for DC what Kevin Feige represented for Marvel Studios, a singular, authoritative, long-term creative leader who could serve as the unified voice and vision for the entire DC cinematic enterprise, providing the kind of consistent quality control, coherent storytelling strategy, and confident creative direction that the DCO had so conspicuously and damagingly lacked throughout its existence. The search for this person would prove to be the most consequential executive decision in DC cinema's recent history, though it would take several more months before it reached its resolution. In the meantime, the existing DCO development slate began to feel the chilling effects of the new leadership's scrutiny almost immediately and quite directly. In August 2022, the respected entertainment journalist Tatiana Siegel of Rolling Stone published the report that landed like a bombshell within the DC fan community and the broader entertainment industry. She reported that the long-developing standalone Supergirl film was now considered by those familiar with the situation to be highly unlikely to move forward under Zaslav's new WBD regime. The reasoning was not difficult to discern. In a period of aggressive corporate restructuring, debt reduction, and strategic reassessment, a project that had been in various stages of stalled development for 4 years, had never progressed beyond early screenplay work, and existed within a creative universe that was itself undergoing fundamental reconsideration, was an obvious candidate for cancellation. The report proved to be entirely and precisely accurate. Around the same period in the late summer and early fall of 2022, the Supergirl standalone project was quietly and without any formal public announcement cancelled, bringing to an unceremonious and deeply anticlimactic end a development journey that had spanned 4 years, survived a global pandemic, incorporated a major new casting of the character in a different film, being publicly announced as part of DC's release slate, and ultimately being undone not by any creative failure but by the grinding machinery of corporate reorganization and strategic reset. It was a frustrating and painful outcome for everyone who had invested creative energy, professional commitment, and personal hope in the project across those 4 years, and it appeared to draw a definitive final line under this particular chapter of Supergirl's long and complicated cinematic history. But the end of one chapter, as it would spectacularly prove, was simultaneously the beginning of something far more ambitious, far more carefully considered, and far more creatively exciting than anything that had come before it. At the very end of October 2022, just weeks after the quiet cancellation of the old Supergirl project, Warner Bros. Discovery made the announcement that would change the entire future of DC on screen and set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately produce the 2026 film. James Gunn, the immensely talented and creatively distinctive writer-director who had taken the obscure cosmic comic Guardians of the Galaxy and transformed it into one of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's most beloved, critically acclaimed, and commercially successful franchises, demonstrating in the process a unique ability to blend genuine emotional depth with irreverent humor, spectacular visual imagination, and an extraordinary gift for character. And Peter Safran, one of Hollywood's most experienced, strategically astute, and commercially successful genre producers, with a track record built across numerous major studio productions. They were jointly and officially appointed as the co-chairs and co-chief executive officers of the newly established DC Studios, a dedicated creative entity that would now exercise full, unified, and autonomous authority over all of DC's film and television output. The announcement reverberated across the entertainment industry with the force of a genuine seismic event, generating immediate and widespread excitement, relief, optimism, and anticipation among fans and industry observers who had spent years watching DC struggle and stumble without the kind of clear creative leadership that the franchise so obviously and desperately needed. Gunn and Safran moved with a speed and purposefulness that immediately and powerfully signaled that this was not going to be a cautious, tentative, or incremental creative stewardship. Within just 1 week of formally and officially assuming their new roles at the helm of DC Studios, the pair had already assembled a collaborative working group of writers and had begun the genuinely historic and extraordinarily ambitious creative undertaking of developing a comprehensive 10-year master plan for an entirely new DC universe, a universe that would be constructed from its very foundations with coherent, sustained, long-term interconnected storytelling at the absolute center of its design philosophy, with carefully architected character arcs, thematically resonant narrative threads, and creative connections that would unfold, develop, and reward attentive audiences across years and years of films, television series, and other media. This new DCU was formally and officially characterized as a soft reboot of the existing DCU, a deliberately chosen creative framework that acknowledged the considerable history, the beloved performances, and the established audience relationships of the previous franchise, while simultaneously and unambiguously granting Gunn and Safran the creative freedom they needed to reimagine, reconfigure, rebuild, and in many cases completely reinvent essentially every aspect of the DC cinematic world according to their own carefully developed and deeply considered artistic vision and storytelling values. It was a bold, clear-eyed, historically significant declaration of creative intent, and it was the moment from which everything that followed, including the extraordinary and ultimately triumphant second life of the Supergirl project, would flow directly and inevitably. The formal and public birth of the Supergirl film that audiences would eventually see in theaters in June 2026 can be traced to a single landmark date, January 31, 2023, when James Gunn and Peter Safran stood before the world and officially unveiled the first wave of projects that would constitute their newly constructed DC universe. This was the moment that DC fans, industry observers, and entertainment journalists had been waiting for with enormous anticipation and considerable anxiety since Gunn and Safran's appointment as co-CEOs of DC Studios just 3 months earlier, at the moment when the broad promises and ambitious rhetoric about building something new, coherent, and creatively extraordinary would give way to actual, concrete, named projects with real creative teams and real artistic intentions behind them. The slate they revealed was organized under the overarching banner of Chapter 1, Gods and Monsters, a grandly evocative title for the inaugural storytelling chapter of this new universe, one that immediately and powerfully communicated the scale, the mythological ambition, and the tonal range that Gunn and Safran were aiming for. Gods and monsters added divine and the monstrous, the heroic and the terrifying, the cosmic and the intimate. It was a title that said everything about what this new DC universe intended to be and how seriously its architects were taking their responsibility to the characters, the stories, and the audiences they were serving. Among the projects officially announced as part of this inaugural slate was the one that would prove to be among the most creatively exciting and thematically distinctive entries in the entire Chapter 1 lineup, a feature film adaptation of the critically acclaimed comic book miniseries Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, originally published across 8 issues between 2021 and 2022. Written by the immensely talented and widely celebrated Tom King and brought to extraordinary visual life by the breathtakingly gifted illustrator Bilquis Evely. The selection of this particular comic as the foundation for the new DCU Supergirl film was immediately and correctly recognized as a bold and meaningful creative statement. Woman of Tomorrow was not a light, accessible, crowd-pleasing superhero adventure designed for maximum mainstream appeal. It was a dark, morally complex, emotionally devastating, and visually stunning piece of sequential art storytelling that had been praised by critics and readers alike as one of the finest, most ambitious, and most genuinely literary DC comics published in recent memory. It was a work that demanded and rewarded serious engagement, that treated its central character with profound respect and psychological depth, and that asked genuinely difficult moral questions without offering easy or comfortable answers. Choosing it as the basis for Supergirl's cinematic debut in the new DCU was a declaration that Gunn and Safran were building a universe where artistic ambition and creative risk-taking would be valued alongside spectacle and entertainment. James Gunn was characteristically direct, enthusiastic, and specific in describing his vision for the project during the slate announcement, deploying language that immediately and effectively set audience expectations in a particular and exciting direction. He characterized the film as a big science fiction epic, 3 words that conjured a specific and thrilling kind of cinematic experience, suggesting not just superhero action but genuine space opera grandeur, the kind of sweeping, world-building, galaxy-spanning storytelling that had been relatively rare in DC's cinematic output to date. The phrase evoked Star Wars, The Fifth Element, Guardians of the Galaxy, films that used the infinite canvas of science fiction not just as a backdrop for action but as a means of exploring fundamentally human questions about identity, belonging, purpose, and moral choice against the most enormous and visually spectacular possible backdrop. Beyond the scale, Gunn was also explicit and emphatic about the specific characterization he intended to pursue with Kara Zor-El in this film, stating clearly that the DCU would explore a far more hardcore version of Supergirl than had ever been committed to screen before. This was a deliberately provocative and genuinely meaningful creative declaration, a direct signal that the comfortable, warmly heroic, conventionally optimistic portrayals of the character that had dominated her previous screen incarnations were being set aside in favor of something harder, more complicated, more morally ambiguous, and more emotionally raw. This would be a Supergirl defined not by her powers or her heroism but by her wounds, her rage, and her difficult, ongoing struggle to reconcile who she has been forced to become with who she might choose to be. The announcement also brought with it a revelatory and exciting additional piece of information about Tom King's ongoing relationship with the new DC Universe. Beyond his role as the original author of the source material being adapted, King was confirmed to be actively working as one of the writers contributing to the overall story architecture of the DCU itself, meaning that the creative mind behind Woman of Tomorrow was not merely lending his work to be adapted and then stepping away, but was instead playing an active and ongoing role in shaping the larger fictional universe in which the film adaptation would live and breathe. This level of creative continuity between source material and cinematic adaptation was unusual and genuinely exciting, suggesting a depth of respect for King's understanding of these characters and this universe that went far beyond the typical Hollywood relationship with comic book source material. The public and fan response to the Supergirl film announcement was immediate, overwhelming, and in at least one very concrete and measurable way, genuinely extraordinary. Within just days of the official confirmation that a Woman of Tomorrow adaptation was in development, copies of the Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow comic book series had completely and entirely sold out across multiple major retail channels simultaneously. On Amazon, where comics are among the most easily and immediately purchasable items for the general public, stock was depleted almost instantly as the enormous audience that had just heard about the project for the first time rushed to purchase and read the source material. The sellout was not limited to online retail publishing houses, and comic book shops across the country and around the world reported the same phenomenon, with their existing stock of the series disappearing from shelves with remarkable and unprecedented speed. It was a vivid and commercially striking demonstration of the extraordinary cultural power that a major film franchise announcement can exercise over the comics market, and it also spoke to something more fundamental: the genuine hunger that a massive audience had for this particular story, and the excitement generated by the prospect of seeing it brought to cinematic life. James Gunn recognized both the wonderful problem this sellout represented and the opportunity it contained. An enormous new audience was suddenly desperate to engage with the source material, and ensuring that they could actually access it was both a practical necessity and a promotional opportunity. He publicly announced that he was personally and directly working with DC Comics publisher and chief creative officer Jim Lee, the legendary artist and executive who had been one of the defining visual voices of DC Comics for decades, to organize and expedite additional print runs of the series, ensuring that the flood of newly curious readers would not be left without access to the story that had inspired such excitement. As the months following the January announcement unfolded and the DCU's development machinery began turning in earnest, the question of who would actually portray Supergirl in the new film remained publicly unresolved and privately complicated. Sasha Calle, whose casting as Supergirl in The Flash had generated such genuine enthusiasm and whose multi-film contract had suggested a long-term future in the role, found herself in a deeply uncertain and emotionally difficult position. In June 2023, while actively engaged in the promotional campaign for The Flash ahead of its theatrical release, Calle spoke publicly and with evident feeling about the Woman of Tomorrow film and her relationship to it. She expressed genuine and enthusiastic love for the source comic book, speaking about it with a kind of informed passion that suggested she had read and engaged with it seriously and personally. She was also honest and direct about her hopes. She said openly that she hoped to reprise her role as Supergirl in the new DCU film, while simultaneously acknowledging with admirable candor that this outcome was not guaranteed and that the decision was ultimately not hers to make. By this point, she had already participated in a direct meeting with Peter Safran to discuss her future as the character, a meeting that suggested at minimum that her continued involvement was being actively considered and evaluated rather than simply dismissed out of hand. However, behind the scenes, a different and ultimately final creative decision was taking shape. James Gunn, in developing his specific and particular vision for Kara-Zor-El in the new DCU, a vision shaped by the Woman of Tomorrow source material, by his conversations with Tom King and Anna Noguera, and by his own deep creative instincts about what this character needed to be and what kind of performer could bring her to life, eventually concluded that the path forward required a completely fresh start with the new actress rather than a continuation of Calle's portrayal. The decision to move in a different direction with the character was, by all accounts, not made lightly or carelessly, but it was made definitively and finally. For Calle, the news was genuinely devastating, and she subsequently spoke about it with a degree of honesty and vulnerability that was both rare in Hollywood and deeply humanizing. She described herself as feeling heartbroken and deeply frustrated by the decision, emotions that were made even more acute and more specific by a particularly painful piece of context. During the production of The Flash, Calle had actually filmed an entirely different alternate ending to the movie, an ending that had been specifically written and shot with the explicit intention of establishing and setting up future appearances for her version of Supergirl within the ongoing DCU narrative. That alternate ending, that carefully constructed creative bridge to a future that was now never going to happen, represented a concrete and tangible investment of creative effort and professional hope that had been rendered completely meaningless by the direction DC Studios had ultimately chosen to take. The waste of that work and the unrealized potential of that carefully planted story seed was a source of real and understandable grief. Through all of it, however, Kale maintained her dignity and her artistic self-respect, making clear that despite the pain of the outcome she remained genuinely and deeply proud of her work in the role, proud of the performance she had delivered, proud of what she had brought to the character within the context of The Flash, and unwilling to let the disappointment of the final decision diminish or overshadow her own sense of artistic accomplishment and integrity. While the Supergirl casting question was being privately and painfully resolved, another major and ultimately interrelated casting development was simultaneously unfolding in the world of DC speculation and reporting. For several months, persistent and widely circulating rumors had been suggesting that Jason Momoa, who had spent 7 years as one of the DC's most prominent and beloved stars, portraying Arthur Curry, Aquaman in a string of films from his debut in Batman v Superman in 2016 to the Aquaman sequel in 2023, would be making a significant transition within the new DCU, leaving behind the noble, ocean-commanding Arthur Curry in favor of an entirely different and tonally very different DC character. The character in question was Lobo, the notorious, virtually indestructible, magnificently unhinged interstellar bounty hunter and mercenary whose anarchic personality, extraordinary violence, and complete moral independence made him one of the most distinctive and beloved characters in the DC Comics universe, and one whose absence from any live-action screen adaptation had long been considered one of the most glaring and frustrating missed opportunities in superhero cinema. In October 2023, these long-circulating rumors gained substantial and credible new weight when it was reported that Momoa had engaged in active and substantive discussions with DC Studios about the possibility of officially taking on the Lobo role within the new DCU. The conversations were reported to have centered on two possible pathways for the character's introduction: an appearance in the first major DCU theatrical release, Superman, 2025, or alternatively a dedicated standalone Lobo film of his own. The idea of Momoa bringing his particular combination of ferocious physicality, wild charisma, and genuine comedic instincts to the role of Lobo was immediately and enthusiastically embraced by the fan community, which recognized almost universally that the qualities that had made Momoa such a compelling and distinctive screen presence were in many ways perfectly calibrated for the specific and outrageous demands of the Lobo character. In November 2023, the Supergirl film's development took another major and genuinely exciting step forward when the identity of the screenplay's author was publicly revealed. Anna Nogueira was confirmed to be writing the script for the new DCU Supergirl film, a confirmation that came with a fascinating and context-enriching backstory that made her involvement feel particularly fitting and meaningful. Nogueira was not, it emerged, a stranger to the Supergirl cinematic project. She had actually been previously attached to write a Supergirl film back in 2022, during the final and uncertain months of the old DCU era when the character was being developed as a potential spin-off from The Flash under the previous creative regime. When Gunn and Safran took over DC Studios and began the process of evaluating what had been done on various projects and determining what to carry forward into their new universe, they encountered Nogueira's work, and their reaction to it was, by all accounts, immediate and strongly positive. They were so genuinely impressed by the quality, the intelligence, and the creative vision of her writing that they made the specific and deliberate decision to bring her back to work on their own completely reimagined take on the Supergirl story. Rather than starting fresh with the new writer, this decision to retain Nogueira across the transition from old DCU to new DCU was a meaningful endorsement of her talent and her understanding of the character, and it was further cemented by the announcement that she had signed an overall writing deal with DC Studios, a broad and ongoing creative partnership that tied her professional future to the larger DCU enterprise and signaled the depth of institutional confidence and investment that Gunn and Safran had placed in her abilities. James Gunn took to his social media platforms to personally and enthusiastically confirm Nogueira's involvement in the project, using the occasion to offer his own evocative and beautifully precise characterization of the film she was crafting. He described it as a beautiful, star-spanning tale, a phrase that did remarkable work in just 5 words, simultaneously capturing the cosmic, galaxy-crossing scale of the story's physical setting and the deep, intimate emotional beauty that he clearly felt Nogueira had brought to the material. It was the language of someone who had genuinely been moved by what he had read, not the careful, measured promotional language of a studio executive managing expectations, but the authentic enthusiasm of a filmmaker and storyteller who had encountered a piece of writing that had genuinely excited and inspired him.